Hello and welcome to Frankly Speaking, where we dive deep into regional headlines and speak with leading policymakers and business leaders. I am Katie Jensen. On this episode, we hear from Hala Rharrit, the former US State Department Arabic language spokesperson, and the first senior diplomat to publicly resign in protest of Washington's approach to Gaza. Has her resignation made an impact? Will President Biden's new peace plan ever be accepted by Netanyahu's right-wing government? Or could his support for Israel cost him the November elections? Ms. Rharrit, thank you for joining us on Frankly Speaking. Now, you were reportedly the first senior US State Department official to resign over your country's position on the war in Gaza. Now, several other people have also followed suit, offering their resignation, and yet the US position doesn't really seem to have changed. It still shies away from restraining Israel. Frankly speaking, do you feel like your resignation has been in vain, or do you think your position has made a difference?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. It really was not for me to say in vain or not. I did it really to follow my conscience, and I did it really in service of my country. I became a diplomat 18 years ago to help the United States promote its interests throughout the world, specifically in the Arab world, and to strengthen ties throughout this particular region. And I felt like I could effectively do that for the last 18 years. This policy, unfortunately, made it impossible. I saw that there was mass killings in Gaza that my government, unfortunately, was enabling through continuous flow of US weapons. I could go on and on about the atrocities that we all bear witness to these last few months. I did everything I could since October 7th to try to dissuade the US position, to try to help the situation. But after a while, it became clear that the policy was not shifting. And so I decided to submit my resignation, also to speak out on behalf of the United States, not as a diplomat, but as an American citizen, to try to help the situation from the outside.
Okay, well, let me understand here. Let me be very clear. Was it the US position, was it the policy that you were opposed to, or was it the specific talking points that you were given? Because in a report from CNN last month, and I'm going to quote you here, you said the talking points made you look like you were dehumanizing Palestinians and were much more catered for local audiences in America. So I think there's some who could argue that you potentially resigned because you were concerned out of fear of the way the job made you look to the rest of the world rather than actually being opposed to the US policy.
So a couple of things. First, I would want to very clearly say that I was not opposed to the policy based on personal reasons. I'm actually a political officer. Before I was a spokesperson for the State Department, which was my last role, I'm actually a political affairs officer. This is what I've done my entire career. I served as a political and human rights officer in Yemen, as a deputy political economic chief in Qatar. I served as well throughout the region, including Egypt. All of these countries were deeply involved in this particular crisis. So I brought my experience to bear. I myself survived 3 terrorist attacks against the US mission in Yemen. I worked on counter-violent extremism. So yes, I was opposed to the policy based on my experience and my regional expertise in the Middle East and what I've done for my country in this part of the world. My latest position was as spokesperson. And I was the one that was supposed to go out on Arab television and promote this policy. I can say I did not become a diplomat to promote a war. And I certainly didn't become a diplomat to promote a plausible genocide. So from the very beginning, there were major concerns that I made very clear about our talking points, that they were indeed dehumanizing to the Palestinians, that they did not acknowledge the plight of the Palestinians in Gaza, that they tried to gloss over the suffering of Palestinians. And why I made that point is that as spokespeople, our job was not just to be communicators, our job was to be effective communicators. And what I was documenting on a daily basis and reporting back to Washington was that what we were saying was creating anti-American sentiment, was generating a backlash. And that in itself was not in the interest of the United States.
Sure, and absolutely, and I understand that. I guess I wonder, why did you take so long to resign in terms of everything you said there? Because I think President Biden was very clear at the start of the war. He said there are no red lines for Israel. We've seen Washington repeatedly veto a ceasefire, the creation of Palestinian states. So why did it take to the death of 35,000 Palestinians for you to develop a conscience?
That's a very, very fair question. I believed in my government. I continue to believe in my government despite all of it. And I felt it was my duty and my responsibility to stay on and make my voice heard. Part of what I did as spokesperson was generate daily reports back to Washington, covering pan-Arab media, not just traditional media, but social media. And we all have been witnessing what has been happening on Arab social media, specifically everything that has been coming out of Gaza. I needed and I wanted Washington to see this, and I sent those images that were going viral of the toddlers being killed, of the children being burnt. I sent these images to Washington to wake up their conscience as well, to show them that Americans were being blamed for this, not just the Israelis, and that is fundamentally not in the US interest. I felt it was my duty as an American diplomat to stay on and do it and say that. But unfortunately, as you said, it became abundantly clear that there were no red lines. And it was intensely disheartening, day after day, week after week, month after month, to see that we would continue to send more and more arms. And I would stress what is in violation of US law in addition to international law. And that is why I eventually submitted my resignation after countless conversations internally, which basically made me feel like no matter what I would do, no matter what anybody else would do, the position wasn't changing.
Okay, so on the one hand, you're sending these video footages of these babies being beheaded, of these children being massacred, this man-made famine. We continue to see aid being blocked as well. Then on the other side, you're being given these talking points to be able to share as the Arabic language spokesperson. Tell me, what were the talking points? What was it about them that you felt were so despicable that you could not continue to share them?
Sure. So to be clear, as spokespeople, we here in the region, we're foreign language spokespeople. So whenever there's a crisis, or anything for that matter, we wait for Washington to get ahead of the story. We wait for Washington to give us our talking points, and then we come out overseas and we amplify. But when it comes to this particular crisis, the situation never really calmed down for us to begin to amplify. And when we did get our talking points, they were very, very heavily focused on Israel has a right to defend itself. Of course, Israel has a right to defend itself against terrorist attacks that occurred on October 7th, and that was horrific, and we all expected them to defend themselves. However, the talking points that I was expected to deliver to this part of the world really failed to acknowledge the plight of the Palestinians. You cannot speak about one people without speaking about the suffering of another people. And I made that abundantly clear from the very beginning. I had intense pushback to Washington, and I actually refused to do interviews on Gaza. Before October 7th, I had done over 100 interviews on any given topic: Sudan, the Russia-Ukraine war, the earthquake in Syria and Turkey. And I was proud and honored to represent my government in this part of the world, as the face of the US government in this part of the world. But I could not in good conscience go out and promote these talking points, which were neglecting an entire population and were also quite repetitive and ineffective. There's only so many times you can say you are concerned about the loss of civilian life. There's only so many times you can ignore who is actually the perpetrator. We would fail to hold Israel to account in our talking points. And again, my major issue was that these talking points were hurting the United States. They were causing a backlash. And as an American diplomat, my job was to help my country, not hurt it. And I was documenting this backlash and growing anti-American sentiments.
So you were happy to share the talking points, but you felt that they were painting America in a bad light.
I did not share the talking points. I did not.
Okay.
I refused from the very beginning to do interviews on Gaza. I did not do a single interview on this topic, which obviously got me in a lot of trouble.
Because, I mean, you've worked for the US State Department for 20 years. We mentioned earlier your first stint, almost 18 years, I think. Your first stint was in Yemen. And I feel like surely, you know, given your past experience, there must have been some understanding that at times, as the spokesperson, you would have to be able to defend the undefendable, you know, in much the same way that a tobacco industry spokesperson has to be able to come out and discuss the fact that they feel that cigarettes don't cause cancer. Surely there has to be that kind of understanding when you stepped into this role.
No, I actually quite disagree with your premise. As bad as we may seem at the moment, I would not compare a tobacco company to the US government.
Okay.
I was actually, like I said, quite proud to represent my country throughout the world. I served in South Africa, I served in Hong Kong, I served across this region, and we've done a lot of good. We've done a lot of good, and this is what pained me. This is what was an agony for me as someone that tried to strengthen ties with the United States and so many countries across the region, that we were failing ourselves. We were failing the vision that so many had of the United States and continue to have, and the hope that so many have in us. So no, I never felt before this that I was compromising my values. I thought that I was promoting US values such as press freedom, such as human rights. And I was very proud to do it. But I can tell you in this specific issue, for example, I tried to get a statement out on press freedom and the fact that there were so many Palestinians killed in Gaza. And I was shocked and horrified that I got so much pushback from colleagues, including in Washington, that said, we can't say anything about this. That is what I opposed.
At what point were you told that?
I think it was when there was a spate of killing of journalists at one point. Potentially when the cameraman for Al Jazeera got killed. I mean, it was one thing after another with the killing of journalists and journalists getting injured and targeted. And so I said, we in this part of the world can't even face our Arab journalist colleagues even for coffee. It's a shame that we have not said anything publicly advocating for their safety and security. It is a fundamental American value to promote freedom of press. It's a fundamental American value to ensure that journalists are protected.
Sure,
and the fact that we
and
haven't
obviously
said
we're now
anything
seeing
was problematic.
aid workers targeted as well. Let me draw your attention, though, to the recent peace plan. You know, huge headlines, of course, come out over the weekend as well. President Biden has presented an Israeli-led peace proposal. He said, tell me, what do you think of this plan? Do you think it's a case of better late than ever, or is it now too little too late?
Well, first and foremost, the priority is to stop the fighting and to stop the violence. By any means necessary. I think we can see that there's been intense suffering, and every day that this conflict continues, there are more lives that are lost in Gaza. And I was very pleased to see that the president from the podium was advocating for a ceasefire and saying it is now time for this war to end. Of course, it is horrific that it's taking this long. And I'm also very concerned that we have not stopped our U.S. weapons flow to Israel. It does not address the fact that we are still in violation of U.S. and international law for all intensive purposes, and that we continue to supply deadly ammunition, offensive weaponry to the state of Israel, and that also needs to stop. And obviously, the issue of a two-state solution and the Palestinian right to self-determination needs to be included in that. But for the immediate term, we need a ceasefire. We need the weapons to stop dropping, and we need the Gazans to be able to breathe and to live.
Sure, but do you think this peace plan has the potential to be approved? You know, particularly, I think, you know, given the pressure that Mr. Netanyahu is facing, if he pushes ahead with peace, he's likely going to lose his power.
Look, I think President Biden alluded to this in terms of the internal struggles within Israel as well. But we've also seen the Israeli people stand up and demand a ceasefire. We've seen all of the protests within Israel. And I think there's mounting pressure from the families of the hostages that are demanding that their families justly return home. And so I'm hopeful. You know, this conflict has been so difficult that every time I have hope, that hope is shattered. But I am, again, hopeful that because the president said it from the podium, and the fact that Hamas agreed to a very similar ceasefire agreement not too long ago, that this will hopefully alleviate some of the suffering. We'll have to wait and see.
Let's see, of course, we've seen a number of the extreme right-wing members of Mr. Netanyahu's government come and threaten to walk out of Parliament as well. And I think Mr. Netanyahu is also very well aware that when the war stops, he's going to be questioned over those October 7 attacks.
Absolutely.
And exactly how that happened. But let me ask a little bit about your work, because, of course, we've seen a spate of other resignations as well. I think around 9 in total now. I know 2 other US State Department officials, Josh Paul and Anel Shalin, they've also resigned in protest of the US policy. Tell me, is this something that you were all planning together? Have you spoken with them? Was this done in coordination? And what are the next steps for all of you?
Yeah, no, this was not at all done in coordination. We all actually come from different walks of life in terms of what our particular fields of expertise are and where we all worked. But we have come together since we've all resigned. I actually just had a very nice conversation with all of them virtually because I'll be going to Washington soon, and so I plan on meeting all of them in person. So we're all continuing to do what we were doing from the inside. From the inside, we were trying to bring an end to this suffering and to try to advocate for our government, because in the long run, we all know that this is hurting U.S. interests. This is hurting the United States of America, and we're all continuing to do what we've been doing to try to help our country end this carnage.
I have to wonder, from your experience as a long-time state official, do you or your colleagues who are currently advising the president, if we put even the humanitarian aside, surely do they not realise that adopting such a pro-Israeli stance, when we see babies, children being massacred, when we have warnings from the United Nations that this famine is man-made, surely they understand this has the huge potential to radicalise Muslim Arab youth, even create Hamas 2.0?
Absolutely. This was my argument for months, every single day, that again, if you want to even ignore the plight of the Palestinians, even if you are choosing to not acknowledge their humanity, this is not in the interests of the Israeli people, because all this will do is generate an endless cycle of violence, endless cycle of revenge, and that does not serve Israeli interests, and it certainly does not serve the United States. It will continue to destabilize the Middle East for generations to come. All the countries in this region will have to deal with that. Violence is not the answer. Bombs is not the answer. A political solution which actually recognizes the dignity and the humanity of the Palestinians, establishes a state of self-determination for the Palestinians. That is the only solution to this, and the only thing that really can counter extremism. And we've seen that. And that's what we need to get to, that type of political resolution.
And yet the US continues to deny the creation of Palestinian statehood. But look, it's not just Arab and Muslim youth that obviously have been hugely angered by this. I think we've all seen those scenes coming out of US universities over the last month, 130 universities and colleagues right across the states with these huge protests. Tell me, what do you think was the main instigator of these protests? Clearly, students there are not buying the official line. Do you think in many respects it's been the TikTok effect?
I have, and I don't want to minimize it to that, right? But what I can say is that I do think there's a generational shift in America, in that older generation receive their news from mainstream media. Mainstream media in America, whichever channel you're watching, has its own bias, has its own talking points that they're generating, their own interests that they're trying to amplify, whereas young people get their news from social media. And those are the types of images that I was also sharing to Washington. Images directly from the photojournalists in Gaza, directly from the influencers. They became influencers, and we were watching their displacement over and over again. We were watching their families suffer. We were watching the corpses, images that we've never seen in our entire lifetimes, I think. Obviously, there have been conflicts and horrors and atrocities around the world. Right now, there are atrocities happening in Sudan, in the DRC. We are not seeing it on our phones the same way that we are seeing it in Gaza just because of access. It's starting to happen as well in those other parts of the world. And hopefully that will raise awareness to the plight of the Sudanese, the Congolese. The situation in Gaza was so abundantly evident through everybody's phone. Images that were going viral, that anyone that is human with a conscience really would be enraged at what was happening. And the fact, as American citizens, as American taxpayers, we were seeing proof that it was American bombs that was causing this carnage. It was too much for too many students to handle. And rightly so, they asked for their universities to divest from their any type of military support to Israel and for a ceasefire.
And of course, there's so much military funding involved in the universities as well. I know Johns Hopkins University, they received more than twice as much money from defence contracts over the last decade than from tuition. Pentagon funding alone accounts for almost a quarter of the university's total income as well. And I think it is so closely linked. How do you see this war ending? As someone who really has been involved behind the scenes at a very senior diplomatic level, what's your feeling? How, if and when will this crisis finish?
I think it's up to the international community to make it finish. For the United States, I'm hoping that President Biden increases the U.S. leverage on Israel to accept a ceasefire deal. I was pleased that he said it's time for the war to end. That's the first time that he said anything like that publicly. But we need to back that up. Enough rhetoric, enough just words, enough saying we're saddened by the loss of life. We need to see action. So if ceasefire does not happen now with this deal, the U.S. needs to cut offensive weaponry to Israel now. That will help us not only pressure the Israelis to finally make compromises on a ceasefire, but it will also help us with Arab states because we will regain our credibility. And that in turn will help them pressure Hamas to also make concessions and take a deal. By any means necessary at this point, we need to use diplomacy to bring an end to this carnage. We cannot, in good conscience, see children dying of starvation. Children are dying of starvation, and I'm repeating that because it is maddening. It is insane that this is man-made. It's absolutely unacceptable, and it has to come to an end now. I will also stress the role of the international community writ large, the ICJ, the ICC. This needs our support as global citizens. These are international institutions that are extremely influential and powerful. They will not bring a resolution, but they can bring accountability, or at least try to bring accountability, and we as global citizens need to support them in that.
And of course, we've seen several rulings from the ICJ come out. We've now seen the prosecutors from the ICC step forward with these potential arrest warrants as well. And I agree with your comments about, the weapons in particular, but of course, we've heard from President Biden saying, we're not going to continue to send, artillery and shells, and yet we have seen it continue despite the advance into Rafah that previously that was going to be a no-go zone.
Mm-hmm.
We talk about turning words into action, and it doesn't feel like we've seen enough of that just yet. Tell me, I'd be interested to get your thoughts. Now that you're no longer an official, how do you see Gaza weighing in on the upcoming November elections?
Intensely. I think it will weigh in intensely because as we've talked about the generational shift, I think young Americans have been consuming all of this carnage on their phones, and they've risen up. It's awakened their consciousness, not just in terms of Gaza, but in terms of so many injustices in this world. And they're seeing through a lot that the government has sort of tried to promote, and they're demanding a change. They're demanding social change, and it doesn't matter what walks of life. And I want to stress this, that a lot of this movement, it's not about an us versus them narrative, not at all. People that are supporting the Palestinians in Gaza come from all faiths, all backgrounds, and it's for the sake of humanity and nothing else.
Of course, we've recently seen comments from President Trump as well, who was recently at the UFC as well. He said he would end the war in Gaza in just one day. Do you believe him?
No, I don't. Mostly because, he doesn't have a stellar track record of being believable. And I do think he is a threat to our democracy in the United States. But at the same time, I see as a diplomat that quite honestly, both parties benefit from war. Both parties benefit from weapon sales. Both parties benefit from campaign contributions from the arms industries. And that's something that I've been intensely concerned about as a diplomat. Because as U.S. Foreign Service officers, we were never allowed to receive any sort of contribution. Even a cup of coffee, I would be worried if someone bought me a cup of coffee, because we always had to be intensely transparent when it came to our dealings, because we would never want a conflict of interest. The same is not the case for our politicians who are able to profit from war, and that is extremely problematic and dangerous on both sides of the aisle.
So tell me, who will you be voting for November 5th?
Oh, I don't know if I can say that publicly. I don't know, I don't know quite yet. My heart, honestly, is still quite shattered by the situation and the fact that President Biden has enabled so much carnage, has enabled, at this point, 40,000 Palestinians to be killed. It's too much. And as someone that served my country for 18 years, I'm still quite devastated by it all. So I will see at that point who I will vote for. I can't make that determination now, but there are also other candidates. There have been some very pro-Palestinian candidates out there as well that I have my eye on. And I want to be clear, it's not strictly about Gaza, but more about social justice and justice for Americans as well. Because as we're shipping all of these arms to Israel, the U.S. people are suffering, Americans are suffering, our education system is suffering, our healthcare system is suffering. A lot of this money needs to be used at home to take care of Americans instead of using bombs to kill children in Gaza.
So who is your prediction then? Who do you think that the next president of the United States will be?
really it depends on the outcome of what happens to Trump, if he ends up going to jail or not, quite honestly, if it's ruled that as a convicted felon, he's able to run. But I can tell you the U.S. is extremely divided at this point. And it really is a 50-50 as far as I see it. But it is abundantly clear that the uncommitted movement, and I don't know if your followers have followed the uncommitted movement in Washington, but it's really been led by Democrats that have been so appalled by the president's handling of Gaza that they are vowing to not support him in the upcoming elections. And we've seen that many states have had significant uncommitted votes, that they'll have delegates at the Democratic convention. So the Democratic Party is split at this time. It really is, whereas the Republican Party, I think, will follow Trump if he is the Republican nominee. So the Democratic Party is in trouble. And so I think that was also part of the president's plan for calling for a ceasefire.
Well, of course, Mr. Trump is slightly ahead in the polls. That's changed a little bit since last week's conviction, 34 felony charges, but 6 months away, time will tell. Ms. Rharrit, thank you so much for joining us today on Frankly Speaking and sharing your insights with us. We do appreciate your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.